Ladies and gentlemen, there is a moment in life when walking away becomes louder than staying, when silence says what years of explaining never could. If you've ever wondered what truly happens after you disappear from a narcissist's world, not in anger, not in drama, but in calm, unwavering silence, then stay with me. Because this isn't about revenge and it isn't about them missing you. It's about what shifts when control is lost. Identities are shaken, and you choose peace over chaos. By the end of this, you won't just understand their reaction, you'll understand your power. No contact is often misunderstood as absence, withdrawal, or emotional distance, but in truth, it is silence with power. It is not the silence of fear, confusion, or punishment. It is the silence that comes from clarity. When someone chooses no contact, they are not disappearing, they are standing still in their truth. They are saying, without words, I will no longer participate in what harms me. That kind of silence carries weight because it is intentional, grounded, and final. For a long time, many people speak, explain, plead, defend, and hope to be understood. Words are poured out like water into a cracked cup, never staying, never nourishing anything. No contact begins when a person realizes that words have lost their value in a space where respect never lived. Silence then becomes the only language left that still honors the self. It is not passive, it is decisive. It draws a line that says, this is where I stop. This silence is powerful because it removes access to your emotions, your reactions, your energy, and your time. It is the moment you stop feeding a dynamic that survived on your presence. Silence forces reality to speak for itself. There are no arguments to twist, no explanations to manipulate, no emotions to provoke. What remains is the truth, bare and undeniable. No contact is also an act of self-trust. It means you no longer need external validation to confirm what you felt was real. You stop negotiating with your intuition. Silence becomes a shield, not a void. It protects your nervous system, your healing, and your sense of identity. In that quiet space, clarity grows. Strength returns. You begin to hear your own voice again. That is why no contact is not weakness. It is restraint. It is self-respect in its most disciplined form. Silence with power does not beg to be heard. It simply stands firm, and that firmness changes everything. And once that silence is in place, something becomes unmistakably clear. What they feel in your absence is not the ache of losing you as a person, but the shock of losing what you provided. Because narcissists don't miss people the way healthy, emotionally grounded individuals do. They miss access. They miss influence. They miss the emotional leverage they once held. When you were present, your reactions fed the dynamic. Your empathy, your forgiveness, your willingness to explain and repair gave them a sense of importance. You became the emotional regulator, the mirror that reflected their worth back to them. And when that mirror goes dark, it doesn't create heartbreak in them. It creates panic. Not because love has been lost, but because control has been removed. This is why silence unsettles them so deeply. They are not grieving connection, they are grappling with irrelevance. The loss they experience is the loss of power over your emotions, your time, and your attention. They miss knowing they could provoke a reaction, pull you back into conversation, or rewrite the narrative through engagement. Without that access, they are left alone with themselves, and that is the place they avoid the most. To a narcissist, control feels like safety. It reassures their fragile sense of identity. So when you no longer respond, explain, or engage, it feels like rejection, even if you never intended it that way. Your silence becomes a message they cannot reinterpret. They no longer matter in the way they once did, and that realization stings far deeper than missing companionship ever could. This is also why their reactions after long no contact can feel disproportionate or confusing. The intensity isn't about love resurfacing, it's about power slipping through their fingers. They don't long for shared moments or emotional intimacy. They long for the position they once held in your inner world. And when that position is gone, they feel exposed, unsettled, and stripped of the control they believed was permanent. And when that control disappears, it doesn't just frustrate them, it destabilizes them. Because for a narcissist, control was never just a tool, it was an identity. They knew who they were by how much they could affect you. Your emotions, your reactions, your availability became the proof of their significance. So when you go silent, it doesn't feel like distance. It feels like erasure. Your silence forces them to confront something they spend their lives avoiding, a self that exists without an audience. Without your responses, they can no longer measure themselves. They can't tell if they are admired, feared, desired, or needed. And that uncertainty creates an internal chaos they don't know how to sit with. The absence of your voice becomes a crack in the image they worked so hard to maintain. This is why long no contact disrupts their identity so deeply. It strips away the external validation they use to define themselves. They are left asking questions they cannot answer honestly. Am I still important? Do I still matter? Was I ever as powerful as I believed? These questions don't lead to growth. They lead to discomfort. And discomfort feels like a threat. In that space, they may become restless, reactive, or even obsessed. Not because they want reconciliation, but because they want relief from the identity crisis your silence triggered. Your absence reflects a reality they cannot control, that they are no longer central in your world. And when someone builds their sense of self on being central, being ignored feels like annihilation. Meanwhile, something profound is happening on your side of the silence. As their identity begins to unravel, yours begins to solidify. You are no longer shaping yourself around their moods, needs, or expectations. Your sense of self is no longer borrowed or distorted. It is returning to you piece by piece. And this is the quiet power of no contact. It doesn't just remove you from a toxic dynamic. It reveals who relied on you to feel real and who you become when you no longer carry that burden. And as their sense of identity wavers, another reality sets in, one they are deeply unprepared for. The space you once occupied does not stay empty in a way they can manage. It becomes a void, not a quiet, reflective space, but a hollow absence that nothing else seems to reach. They try to replace it quickly because they have always believed people are interchangeable. New attention, new admiration, new sources of validation step in, but something feels off. The supply is there, yet it doesn't satisfy in the same way. That's because long no contact doesn't just remove you as a person. It removes the emotional role you played. You knew their rhythms, you anticipated their moods, you responded in ways that made them feel powerful, seen, and central. New people don't know how to mirror them the same way. The reactions are different. The admiration feels thinner. The connection lacks depth, even if it looks impressive from the outside. This is when restlessness grows. They may surround themselves with noise, attention, and activity, yet feel strangely unsatisfied. The void you left cannot be filled easily because it wasn't just attention they were feeding on. It was familiarity, emotional imprinting, and the certainty of your presence. Long no contact makes that absence permanent enough to be felt, not just noticed. And this is where confusion intensifies. Believed you were replaceable, yet your absence lingers in ways they didn't expect. Not because you were perfect, but because you were consistent. Not because you were extraordinary, but because you were emotionally invested. That investment created an imprint, and time only makes it clearer that quick replacements don't erase it. While they scramble to fill that emptiness, you are learning to live without filling anyone else's. You are no longer responsible for soothing, stabilizing, or validating another person's fragile sense of self. The void they feel is the consequence of losing access to your emotional labor, and the peace you gain comes from finally reclaiming it. And when that void refuses to close, their inner world begins to spin, not toward healing, not toward understanding, but through a familiar loop they know all too well. First comes denial. They tell themselves this silence is temporary, that you'll resurface once the shock wears off. They minimize your absence, downplay its meaning, convince themselves they still hold relevance. Denial is their way of staying upright, Hen reality threatens to knock them down. But denial doesn't last long when silence stays consistent. Then comes rage. Anger bubbles up not because they were wrong, but because they were challenged. Your absence feels like defiance, like disobedience, like you broke an unspoken contract that said you would always be available to them. The rage isn't loud at first. Sometimes it's cold, bitter, and resentful. Other times it leaks out through blame, contempt, or quiet hostility disguised as indifference. When rage exhausts itself, curiosity takes over. They begin to wonder. They check. They listen from a distance. They replay conversations. They ask questions they never asked while you were there, not to understand you, but to understand how the narrative changed without their permission. Curiosity is fueled by uncertainty, and uncertainty gnaws at them. And if no contact continues, curiosity can harden into obsession. Not obsession with reunion, but obsession with meaning, with what your silence says about them, with how you could detach so completely. They don't sit with the lesson, they circle it. They don't process the loss, they fixate on regaining certainty. This cycle repeats because it offers motion without growth. It keeps them busy without requiring accountability. Meanwhile, your stillness breaks the loop. You are no longer riding the emotional carousel they built. You stepped off even while it kept spinning. And that is what long no contact truly does. It reveals who is evolving and who is simply reacting. And as that cycle keeps spinning on their side, something else quietly begins to disturb them even more than the silence itself. They start to notice change, not in them, but in you. Your calm, your distance, your steadiness, your ability to exist without reacting. And that is when your healing becomes a threat, because growth exposes what stagnation tries to hide. Your peace stands in sharp contrast to their chaos. Your emotional regulation highlights their volatility. Without saying a word, your progress reflects back everything they refuse to face. And that reflection is unbearable to someone whose entire survival depends on avoiding self-examination. They don't experience your healing as something beautiful or admirable. They experience it as an accusation, as if your strength is saying, I saw the truth and I chose better. And nothing unsettles a narcissist more than the realization that someone escaped the story they tried to trap them in. Your growth dismantles the version of reality where they were superior and you were dependent. It disrupts the hierarchy they relied on to feel powerful. Suddenly, they are not the center of your emotional universe anymore. They are no longer the authority on your worth, and that shift threatens the illusion they've built to protect their ego. This is why they may downplay your healing, mock it, or dismiss it as fake. It's not because they believe that. It's because acknowledging your growth would require acknowledging their role in your pain. And accountability feels like collapse to someone who survives on denial. Meanwhile, you are no longer shrinking to keep peace. You are no longer questioning your reality to preserve connection. You are becoming whole, and that wholeness is something they cannot manipulate. Your healing doesn't chase them. It doesn't explain itself. It simply exists. And in that quiet existence, it reveals a truth they can't outrun. You didn't just leave the dynamic, you outgrew it. And growth, when witnessed by someone who refuses to evolve, doesn't inspire them. It terrifies them. And when that fear sets in, they reach for the one defense that has always protected them from collapse, rewriting the story. Because if they can't control the outsea, anymore, they will try to control the narrative. They begin reshaping the past in ways that preserve their innocence and restore their sense of superiority. What once happened is no longer what happened. It becomes what they need it to have been. In this rewritten version, you are no longer the one who tried, endured, or cared. You become difficult, cold, oversensitive, impossible to please. The pain they caused fades conveniently into the background, replaced by a version of events where they were misunderstood, mistreated, or pushed away. This is not reflection, it is self-protection. They tell this story to others, but more importantly, they tell it to themselves. Because facing the truth would mean admitting they harmed someone who loved them. It would mean confronting the cost of their behavior. And that kind of honesty threatens the fragile structure of their ego. So they rewrite, revise, and reframe until the discomfort dulls. Your silence makes this harder for them. Without your voice to contradict or engage, they are free to construct whatever version soothes them most. But even then, something doesn't settle. Because no matter how often they repeat the story, it doesn't change the outcome. You are still gone. You are still unmoved. You are still healing. And that contradiction lingers. The story says they were right, yet reality says they lost access to someone who no longer needs to defend themselves. That tension is why the narrative keeps shifting, growing more dramatic, more distorted. It's an attempt to drown out the quiet truth. Your absence keeps whispering. Meanwhile, you no longer need to correct the record. You know what happened, you lived it, and peace comes from no longer needing anyone else to validate what you already understand. Their rewritten history may protect their ego, but your clarity protects your future. And yet, even after the story has been rewritten and rehearsed, something still cuts through their defenses: your peace. Because no matter how they explain it away, your calm existence without them feels like rejection. Not the loud kind, not the confrontational kind, but the most painful kind of all, the kind that doesn't argue, the kind that doesn't explain, the kind that simply moves on. To them, your peace feels personal. It feels like a verdict, as if your silence is saying, I didn't just leave you, I chose myself. And that choice lands like abandonment in their nervous system, even though you never promised to stay at the cost of your well-being. They interpret your calm as indifference, and indifference is something they cannot tolerate. Anger, they can provoke. Sadness, they can exploit. Longing, they can manipulate. But peace? Peace gives them nothing to work with. It offers no opening, no leverage, no emotional handle to grab onto. And that emptiness feels like rejection, even if you never intended it to be read that way. This is why they may try to puncture your calm. A sudden message, a memory dropped casually, a reminder of who they once were in your life, not to reconnect, but to test whether they still matter, whether they can still disturb your equilibrium. Your peace challenges their belief that they are unforgettable, indispensable, irreplaceable. What they don't realize is that your peace is not a performance. It's earned. It's built from nights of grief, moments of doubt, and long stretches of choosing yourself, even when it felt unfamiliar. You didn't become calm to make a point. You became calm because chaos was costing you too much. And that's the truth they struggle with most. You didn't reject them out of cruelty. You didn't disappear to punish them. You simply stopped bleeding in a place that kept reopening the wound. Your peace isn't a message to them at all. It's a promise you finally kept to yourself. And as that peace settles in, something else quietly dissolves: the need for answers. At one time, questions filled your mind. Why did they treat me this way? Did they ever care? Was any of it real? Those questions once felt urgent, almost unbearable. You believed closure would come from one last conversation, one final explanation, one moment where everything made sense. But long no contact teaches a different truth. Closure doesn't arrive through contact. It arrives through clarity. With distance, patterns become visible. What once felt confusing now looks consistent. What once felt personal now reveals itself as behavioral. You begin to understand that the pain wasn't caused by a single misunderstanding, but by a repeated refusal to take responsibility. And that understanding brings a deeper, quieter kind of resolution, one that doesn't depend on their honesty or awareness. They, on the other hand, remain trapped in explanation-seeking mode. They want to be understood without understanding. They want relief without accountability. They chase closure externally, hoping someone else will rewrite the ending in their favor. But without self-reflection, there is no clarity, only repetition. Your clarity frees you from the need to revisit the past. You no longer need them to validate your experience, admit fault, or apologize correctly. You've seen enough. You've felt enough. And that knowing becomes grounding. It steadies you. It allows you to move forward without dragging unanswered questions behind you. This is why long no contact feels so final. Not because the door is slammed shut, but because the mind is no longer standing in the doorway. You've stepped fully into your own understanding. You're no longer waiting for insight to come from someone who avoids truth. Clarity replaces confusion. Acceptance replaces longing. And in that shift, closure becomes something you give yourself, not something you wait to receive. And when clarity takes root, something even more powerful unfolds. The focus shifts, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Your attention moves away from them and settles back where it always belonged, within yourself. Their reactions, their confusion, their attempts to rewrite the past begin to feel distant, almost irrelevant. Not because they never mattered, but because they no longer define the dire. This is one of your life. This is where the true victory reveals itself. Not in whether they regret losing you, not in whether they ever understand what they did, but in who you have become as a result of choosing yourself. You didn't win by disappearing from their world, you won by rebuilding your own. You become emotionally unreachable, not cold, not closed, but grounded. You no longer bleed into spaces that cannot hold you. You stop offering depth to those who only skim the surface. Your boundaries are no longer defensive, they are natural extensions of self-respect. And that changes how you move through every relationship that follows. While they remain reactive, measuring their worth through external responses, you begin living from internal alignment. You trust your intuition. You listen to your body. You recognize red flags without negotiating with them. The lessons you learned were costly, but they were transformative. And here is the quiet truth that ties it all together. Their reaction after long no contact is a reflection of what was lost for them. Your transformation after long no contact is a reflection of what was reclaimed for you. You didn't leave to make a statement. You left to survive, to heal, to remember who you were before your voice was diminished and your reality was questioned. And in doing so, you became someone they can no longer reach. Not because you are hiding, but because you have risen. The real ending isn't their realization. It's your liberation. And that kind of freedom doesn't need an audience. It speaks for itself in the way you live, the way you love, and the way you finally stand fully in your own life. And if you take nothing else with you today, take this truth and hold it close. The silence you chose was not the end of your story. It was the moment you stopped abandoning yourself. What began as distance became discernment. What felt like loss became liberation. And what once terrified you, being without them, became the very place where you found yourself again. You don't need to wait for them to miss you, regret you, or finally understand you. Their reaction was never the measure of your worth. Your healing is. Every day you stayed silent, every time you resisted the urge to explain, defend, or reopen the door, you were choosing growth over familiarity. And that choice changed you. Long no contact didn't make you colder. It made you clearer. It didn't harden your heart. It taught you where to place it safely. You learned that love without respect is not love, and connection without accountability is not connection. You learned that peace is not empty. It is full of self-trust. Some people will never understand your silence because they benefited from your noise. They will call your boundaries cruelty and your calm indifference. But you know the truth. You know what it cost to stay. You know what it took to leave, and that knowing is enough. As you move forward, remember this: you are not hard to love. You were just loving in a place that could not meet you. And now, you no longer need to prove, perform, or persuade. You are walking differently, speaking differently, choosing differently. Stay with that version of yourself. Protect them, honor them. Because the most powerful message you ever sent was not a word. It was the life you chose to rebuild after silence. And that is how the story truly ends.